You ever wonder how a guy sitting in his garage talking into a microphone became more powerful than every cable news network combined? Here's how it actually happened. December of 2020, Spotify headquarters in Stockholm. Daniel Ek, the chief executive officer, is on a video call with his entire executive team, and from what I've pieced together from multiple reports and interviews, the room is tense. They've just signed Joe Rogan to an exclusive deal, and the number that's been widely reported, $100 million. But here's what most people don't know, and this came out in later reporting: the real number is closer to $200 million when you factor in all the performance bonuses and incentives. $200 million for a podcast. Now, employees are threatening to walk out, advertisers are pulling their money, the media is calling Spotify irresponsible, and according to sources who spoke to the Wall Street Journal, some board members are privately questioning whether Ek just made the biggest mistake of his career. But here's the thing that nobody saw coming. Within 18 months, the Joe Rogan Experience would bring in more than 11 million subscribers to Spotify, generating over $700 million in value according to analyst estimates. That one deal, that one podcast, would fundamentally reshape how media works in America. And the strategy Rogan used to get there: he did everything the experts said not to do. I'm Alex Morgan, this is Behind the Billion, and today we're breaking down how Joe Rogan built the most valuable podcast in history and became more influential than entire television networks in the process. Now look, I spent the last week diving deep into this story, and I mean deep. I read every interview Rogan's done about the podcast, watched probably 40 hours of early episodes, went through Spotify's financial filings, read books about the podcast industry, talked to people who understand the media business. And here's what blew my mind: Rogan didn't set out to build a media empire. He wasn't trying to compete with cable news. He just wanted to have long conversations with interesting people. But the way he approached it, the specific decisions he made about format and length and monetization, those choices accidentally created something that would eventually threaten the entire traditional media industry. So let me take you back to the beginning, because the origin story here is crucial to understanding why this worked. It's 2009. Joe Rogan is 42 years old. He's a successful stand-up comedian. He's hosting Fear Factor on NBC, which is paying him really well. He's commentating for the UFC, and he's got a comfortable life. But here's what's happening behind the scenes, and Rogan's talked about this openly in multiple interviews. He's bored. Not like casually bored, but existentially bored. He's doing the same comedy clubs, the same television format, the same 3-minute interview segments on talk shows where you can't actually say anything real. And he's watching his friend Brian Redban, who's this young tech-savvy guy, mess around with live streaming technology. Now, podcasting already exists at this point, but it's mostly NPR-style shows and tech reviews. Nobody's really figured out how to make it commercially successful. The conventional wisdom in media is that podcasts are a nice hobby. Maybe you can make a few $1,000s a month if you're lucky, but it's not a real business. Every media executive, and I mean every single one, believes that the future is video, that YouTube is where attention is going, that audio is dead outside of drive-time radio. And Rogan, who has zero business training, no media strategy background, just decides to ignore all of that. Here's how it starts, and this detail is important. December of 2009, Rogan and Redban set up a couple of microphones in Rogan's house. Not a studio, his actual house. They've got some basic recording equipment, maybe $2,000 worth of gear total, nothing fancy, and they just start talking. The first episode, and you can still find this online, is literally just Rogan and Redban talking about random stuff for over an hour. No script, no topic, no real plan. Just two guys having a conversation. Now, most people would have quit after episode 5 or 10, because here's what happens at first: nobody listens. I'm not exaggerating, the download numbers for the first few months are pathetic. We're talking maybe a few hundred downloads per episode. Rogan's already famous from Fear Factor and the UFC, and he still can't crack 1,000 listeners. But here's the first critical decision, and this is where the strategy starts to form, even though Rogan probably didn't think of it as strategy at the time. Traditional podcasts in 2009 are 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes max. The industry wisdom is that people's attention spans are short, that you need to respect your audience's time, that concise is better. Every podcasting expert, every media consultant, every industry veteran will tell you that episodes should be tight, edited, focused, under an hour. Rogan does the exact opposite. He makes his episodes 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours, sometimes even longer. And when people ask him why, his answer is beautiful in its simplicity. He says, and I'm paraphrasing from an interview he did years later, because that's how long it takes to have a real conversation. You can't get to the interesting stuff in 30 minutes. You can't get past the rehearsed talking points. People need time to relax, to forget they're being recorded, to actually say what they think. Now think about how crazy this sounds from a business perspective. He's making his product longer when everyone says shorter is better. He's creating more content when everyone says less is more. He's asking his audience for 3 hours of their time when every metric says people want quick hits. This should have failed completely. But here's what Rogan understood, probably intuitively rather than analytically, that nobody else got. The people who would listen to a 3-hour podcast are different from the people who listen to a 30-minute podcast. They're not casual listeners, they're committed. They're not multitasking, they're paying attention. They're not sampling content, they're going deep. And those people, that small audience of people who actually want depth, they become incredibly loyal. Let me paint you a picture of what's happening in 2010, 2011. Rogan's releasing episodes 2 or 3 times a week. He's got comedians on, mixed martial arts fighters, scientists, philosophers, conspiracy theorists, random interesting people he meets. There's no theme, no consistent format, no editorial strategy. One episode is about psychedelic drugs with Duncan Trussell. The next is about astrophysics with Neil deGrasse Tyson. The next is just Rogan and his friends getting high and talking about Bigfoot for 3 hours. Traditional media people are watching this and they think it's amateur hour. No professional producer would allow this format. No network would greenlight this show. No advertiser would touch this content. It breaks every rule of professional broadcasting. And slowly, quietly, it starts to work. By 2011, Rogan's getting about 20,000 downloads per episode. By 2012, it's 50,000. By 2013, it's over 100,000. Now, these aren't huge numbers compared to radio, but here's what's different. These listeners are obsessive. They're not casually tuning in, they're subscribing, they're downloading every single episode, they're listening to the whole thing. The engagement metrics are insane compared to traditional media. And here's where Rogan makes the second critical decision, and this one is even more counterintuitive than the first. He decides not to edit the episodes. Now I need to explain how radical this is. Every single podcast, every radio show, every television program, they all edit. You record for 2 hours, you cut it down to 45 minutes of the best stuff. You remove the boring parts, the tangents, the moments where someone says something unclear or stumbles over their words. This is basic media production. It's been standard practice since the beginning of radio. Rogan just uploads the raw conversation, all of it. If he and his guest go on a 20-minute tangent about nothing, that stays in. If someone tells a story that doesn't land, it stays in. If there's dead air or awkward pauses, it all stays in. And when people ask him why he doesn't edit, his answer is because that's real. That's how actual conversations work. People want to feel like they're in the room, and you can't feel that if everything's polished and perfect. This decision does something really important. It creates authenticity at scale. Listeners feel like they're getting access to the real conversation, not the produced version. They're hearing what Rogan's actually like, what his guests are actually like, without the PR filter. And in an era where every interview is managed and every soundbite is calculated, this raw realness becomes incredibly valuable. Now let's talk about money, because this is where it gets really interesting from a business perspective. It's 2012, 2013, and the podcast is growing. Rogan's now getting consistent 6-figure download numbers per episode, and brands are starting to notice. But here's the thing, traditional podcast advertising is terrible. You get paid based on CPM, cost per 1,000 listeners, and the rates are low. You might make $20 per 1,000 downloads, so even if you're getting 100,000 downloads, that's only $2,000 per episode. Do 3 episodes a week, that's $6,000 a week, maybe $300,000 a year. Not bad for a side project, but not life-changing money. Rogan makes the third critical decision. He says no to traditional advertising. Instead, he only takes sponsors that he personally uses and believes in. And rather than running 60-second produced ads, he just talks about the product conversationally for a few minutes. He tells stories about using it, explains why he likes it, makes it part of the show rather than an interruption to the show. Now this approach has been tried before. It's called host-read advertising. But Rogan takes it further. He negotiates deals where he gets paid more per ad because his conversion rates are so high. According to reports from advertising executives who have worked with him, Rogan's ads convert at 3 to 5 times the rate of normal podcast ads. If a typical podcast ad gets 1% of listeners to check out the product, Rogan's getting 3 to 5%. Why? Because his audience trusts him. They've listened to him talk for hundreds of hours. They feel like they know him. When he says he uses a product, they believe him. This isn't a celebrity endorsement where everyone knows you're being paid. This is a friend recommendation at scale. By 2014, and these numbers are estimates because Rogan doesn't publicly disclose this stuff, but based on industry analysis and reports from sponsors, he's probably making somewhere between $2 and $5 million a year from the podcast. For a show he records in his house with minimal production costs, that's an incredible margin. But here's what's happening that's even more important than the money. The podcast is changing Rogan's entire career. See, most comedians, most celebrities, they need traditional media. You need to be on late-night talk shows to promote your tour. You need to be in magazines to stay relevant. You need the industry gatekeepers to give you access to audiences. Rogan's building a direct relationship with millions of people that bypasses all of that. He can announce a comedy tour on the podcast and sell out arenas without doing a single television interview. He can share his opinions on controversial topics without worrying about getting fired from a network. He's got total creative control and total financial control. And the audience keeps growing. 2015, he's at 500,000 downloads per episode. 2016, it's over 1 million. 2017, some episodes are hitting 2 million downloads. These are numbers that rival major radio shows, and he's doing it without a studio, without a staff, without any of the infrastructure that traditional media requires. Now let me take you to a specific moment that I think crystallizes why this worked when so many other podcasts didn't. It's October of 2015, and Rogan has Elon Musk on the show for the first time. Now, Musk is already famous at this point. He's running Tesla and SpaceX, but he's not yet the household name he is today. And most interviews with Musk are pretty standard. Reporters ask about Tesla's latest car or SpaceX's latest launch. Musk gives his rehearsed answers. It's professional, but kind of boring. Rogan's interview is 2.5 hours long. The first 45 minutes, they just talk about consciousness and artificial intelligence and simulation theory. Musk actually relaxes, starts riffing on ideas, says things he probably wouldn't say in a traditional interview. Then they talk about engineering challenges, then about Musk's vision for the future. Then Musk smokes weed on camera, which becomes this huge news story. But here's what's important. That interview gets over 30 million views when you combine YouTube and podcast downloads. 30 million people watch 2.5 hours of Elon Musk just talking. Not giving sound bites, not promoting anything specific, just having a conversation. And those people finish that interview feeling like they understand Musk better than they would from reading 100 newspaper articles about him. That interview proves something really important. There's a massive appetite for long-form, unfiltered conversation that traditional media isn't serving. People are tired of 7-minute interviews where the guest is obviously just hitting their talking points. They want to see what someone's actually like when they're comfortable, when they've been talking long enough that they forget to manage their image. And Rogan's got the perfect format for delivering that because he's not a journalist with an agenda, he's just a curious guy asking questions. He's not trying to get a gotcha moment, he's trying to understand what the person thinks. And guests can feel that difference, so they open up in ways they don't in traditional media. Now let's talk about what's happening in the broader media landscape, because this is crucial context. It's 2016, 2017, and traditional media is dying. Not struggling, dying. CNN's primetime shows are getting 700,000 viewers on a good night. Fox News is doing better at around 3 million, but those are mostly older viewers. Young people, people under 40, they're not watching cable news at all. They're getting their news from social media, from YouTube, from podcasts. And here's what the traditional media companies don't understand. The thing that's killing them isn't just the platform shift, it's the format. People don't want to be lectured to by anchors reading teleprompters. They don't want 4-minute segments with 7 commercial breaks per hour. They don't want panels where everyone's shouting over each other. They want real, substantive, long-form conversation. Rogan's giving them exactly that, and he's doing it better than any media company because he doesn't have to worry about offending advertisers or pleasing a corporate parent or maintaining a brand image. He can talk to anyone about anything for as long as it's interesting. By 2018, the Joe Rogan Experience is the most downloaded podcast in the world. We're talking about 8 million downloads per episode, some episodes hitting 15 or 20 million. For context, that's more people than watch most cable news shows. Rogan, sitting in his house in California, is reaching a bigger audience than CNN. And this is when the traditional media industry starts to panic. Because it's not just about the numbers, it's about who's listening. Rogan's audience is primarily men between 18 and 45, the exact demographic that advertisers desperately want to reach and that traditional media is completely losing. These are people who don't have cable subscriptions, who don't read newspapers, who don't trust mainstream media. But they'll listen to 3 hours of Joe Rogan because they feel like he's real, like he's one of them. Now I need to talk about the content itself, because this is where Rogan becomes controversial. His show has no editorial filter. He'll talk to scientists and conspiracy theorists, politicians and comedians, mainstream figures and fringe characters. One episode is a serious discussion about climate change with a climate scientist. The next episode is about alien abduction theories. He doesn't fact-check his guests in real time. He just lets them talk and assumes his audience is smart enough to think critically. Traditional journalists hate this. They say he's platforming dangerous ideas, spreading misinformation, not pushing back hard enough on false claims. And look, they're not entirely wrong. There are definitely episodes where guests say things that aren't true, where conspiracy theories get aired without adequate challenge, where the conversation goes off the rails into speculation presented as fact. But here's what Rogan understands that traditional media doesn't. His audience doesn't want him to be a fact-checker or a gatekeeper. They want him to be curious and open-minded. They want to hear different perspectives and decide for themselves what to believe. They're tired of being told what to think by media institutions they don't trust. Is this approach perfect? Does it sometimes lead to misinformation spreading? Yes. But does it create a more authentic and engaging listening experience than highly produced, heavily filtered traditional media? Also yes. And the market is speaking. People are choosing Rogan's format over the traditional format by huge margins. So now we get to the Spotify deal, and this is where the story gets really crazy. It's 2020 May specifically, and Spotify announces they've signed Joe Rogan to an exclusive licensing deal. The number they announce publicly is over $100 million. The media goes insane. How can a podcast be worth that much money? It's just some guy talking. There's no production value, no staff, no expensive infrastructure. But here's what Spotify understood that everyone else missed, and I've read analysis on this from media economists and Spotify's own strategic documents that got leaked. Rogan isn't just a podcast, he's a weapon against Apple and YouTube. Let me explain the strategic logic because this is fascinating. Spotify's core business is music streaming, where they pay about 70% of revenue to record labels. Their margins are terrible. They're basically a middleman getting squeezed on both sides. They need to diversify into content they can own or exclusively license, where the margins are way better. Podcasts are perfect for this because production costs are low and you can build a direct relationship with creators. But here's the problem: most podcasts are available everywhere. You can listen to the same show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever. There's no reason to choose Spotify specifically. So Spotify needs exclusive content that will make people download their app instead of Apple's. And Rogan is the ultimate exclusive content because he's got the biggest podcast in the world, a loyal audience that will follow him to any platform, and he creates enough weekly content to keep people engaged. If Spotify can get Rogan exclusive, they can convert millions of Apple Podcast users to Spotify users. And once those users are on Spotify for Rogan, they might start using Spotify for music too, which creates a whole ecosystem lock-in effect. So the question Spotify is asking isn't, is a podcast worth $100 million? The question is converting 5 to 10 million users from Apple to Spotify worth $100 million? And when you frame it that way, when you do the math on lifetime value of users and the strategic value of competing with Apple, the answer is obviously yes. But here's where it gets complicated, because the moment Spotify announces the deal, the controversy starts. Employees at Spotify, particularly younger employees, start looking through Rogan's back catalog of almost 1,500 episodes, and they find stuff they're not happy about. Episodes with controversial guests, conversations about transgender athletes in sports, discussions about vaccines and COVID that don't align with mainstream medical consensus, jokes and comments that some people find offensive. According to reporting from multiple sources, including the Wall Street Journal and The Verge, there are internal employee meetings where people are demanding Spotify give them editorial control over Rogan's content. They want the ability to remove episodes, to approve guests, to fact-check claims made on the show. And Daniel Ek, the Spotify chief executive officer, is in an impossible position. If he gives employees editorial control, he's essentially neutering what makes Rogan valuable, which is the complete creative freedom and authenticity. But if he doesn't, he's got employee revolt and media criticism saying Spotify is platforming misinformation. According to people familiar with the negotiations, and this has been reported in several places, Ek makes the decision to back Rogan. He tells employees that Spotify is a platform, not a publisher, and that they're not going to editorially control podcast content beyond removing things that clearly violate the law. This decision costs Spotify in the short term. Some employees quit, some artists threaten to pull their music from the platform, media coverage is brutal. But strategically, it's the right call because if Spotify had caved to pressure and started editing Rogan, the entire value proposition would have collapsed. Now let's talk about what happens with COVID, because this is when Rogan becomes genuinely controversial on a national scale. It's 2020, 2021, the pandemic is raging, and Rogan starts having conversations about COVID that don't align with official public health messaging. He has doctors on who question lockdown policies. He talks about alternative treatments like ivermectin. He discusses vaccine side effects. He shares his personal opinions about young, healthy people not necessarily needing to get vaccinated. The traditional media and public health establishment lose their minds. CNN runs segments fact-checking Rogan's claims, calling him dangerous. Anthony Fauci, the government's top infectious disease expert, does interviews criticizing the podcast. There are calls for Spotify to remove episodes or drop Rogan entirely. And here's where you see the fundamental difference between Rogan's approach and traditional media's approach. Traditional media's position is that there's an official narrative on COVID, endorsed by the CDC and WHO and mainstream medical institutions, and that platforms should only allow content that aligns with that narrative. Anything else is misinformation that needs to be removed for public safety. Rogan's position is that he's not a journalist or a public health authority, he's a guy having conversations. He's allowed to talk to doctors who disagree with official policy, to discuss his personal health decisions, to be skeptical of government and pharmaceutical company claims. His audience is smart enough to listen to different perspectives and make their own decisions. Now, I'm not going to tell you who's right here because honestly it's complicated and I'm not a public health expert. What I will say is that from a pure market perspective, Rogan's approach resonated with a massive audience who felt like they weren't getting straight answers from traditional media and government sources. According to Spotify's data, which eventually became public, Rogan's listenership actually increased during the COVID controversy. The episodes that got the most criticism were also some of the most downloaded. Millions of people wanted to hear these conversations, even though, or maybe because, they challenged the official narrative. And this reveals something really important about why Rogan succeeded. He tapped into a massive distrust of institutions. People don't trust the government, don't trust pharmaceutical companies, don't trust traditional media. But they trust Rogan because he seems like a regular person, not an authority figure. He admits when he doesn't know things. He changes his mind when presented with new information. He's skeptical of official stories. Is this always good? No. Sometimes institutional knowledge and expert consensus is actually correct and important. But in an era where institutions have repeatedly lost credibility, where the media has been caught being wrong or biased, where pharmaceutical companies have been caught lying, a lot of people would rather trust the guy who seems authentic even if he's sometimes wrong than the institutions who claim authority but have broken that trust. Let me give you some specific numbers to show you just how big this got. By 2021, the Joe Rogan Experience is averaging around 11 million downloads per episode. Some episodes are hitting 25 to 30 million when you combine podcast downloads and YouTube views. For perspective, the most-watched cable news show, Tucker Carlson Tonight on Fox News, is averaging around 3 million viewers. Rogan's doing 3 to 4 times that number per episode, releasing 3 episodes per week. And here's the crazy part, Rogan's doing this with a team of maybe 5 people. He's got Jamie Vernon, his producer, who sits in the studio and pulls up information when they reference something. He's got a few people handling scheduling and business operations. That's basically it. Meanwhile, CNN has thousands of employees, hundreds of millions in studio infrastructure, bureaus around the world. And one guy in a studio in Austin, Texas, is reaching more people than their entire network. The economics of this are just insane. According to estimates from people who analyze the podcast industry, and I've read reports from companies like Podtrac and Chartable, Rogan's making somewhere between $50 and $75 million per year by 2021, when you combine the Spotify deal with his ongoing sponsorships. That's more than most primetime network television anchors, and his profit margins are like 90% because his costs are so low. But it's not just about the money, it's about the influence. Think about what Rogan can do that traditional media can't. If he mentions a book on his podcast, that book becomes a bestseller overnight. If he talks about a scientific idea, millions of people go research it. If he endorses a political candidate, that candidate gets a massive boost with young male voters. If he criticizes a public figure, that person's reputation takes a hit. This is real power, and it's completely outside the traditional media structure. There's no editorial board, no corporate owner, no advertiser pressure. It's just Rogan's judgment and his audience's trust. And traditional media has no idea how to compete with this. They try to fact-check him, but his audience doesn't care about fact checks from institutions they don't trust. They try to get him deplatformed, but he's got an exclusive deal with Spotify, who's financially committed to him. They try to criticize his lack of journalistic standards, but his audience doesn't want journalism, they want conversation. Now let's talk about the actual number on the Spotify deal, because this is important. The original reporting was $100 million, and that's what most people think Rogan got paid. But in 2024, when Spotify renewed his deal, the Wall Street Journal reported that the original deal was actually worth up to $250 million when you include all the performance bonuses and incentives. And the renewal deal is reportedly worth $200 million for another 3 years. So we're talking about potentially $450 million total over 6 years for a podcast. That's more than the GDP of some small countries. That's more than most professional athletes make in their entire careers. That's more than any actor has ever been paid for a television show. And here's the thing, Spotify's probably getting a good deal. According to analysis from media analysts, and this is based on subscriber growth and retention data that Spotify has shared, the Rogan deal brought in an estimated 11 million new subscribers to Spotify. At $10 per month, if even half of those subscribers stay for 2 years, that's over $1.3 billion in revenue. Plus, Rogan drives engagement, which reduces churn across the platform. Plus, having exclusive content helps Spotify compete with Apple and YouTube. The strategic value is probably worth way more than what they're paying. This is the crazy thing about content in the digital age. The economics work completely differently than traditional media. In traditional media, you need huge audiences to justify costs because production is expensive and distribution is limited. In digital media, production can be cheap and distribution is free, so even smaller audiences can be incredibly valuable if they're engaged and loyal. Rogan proved that you could build something more valuable than a television network with a tiny team and minimal costs, as long as you had a direct relationship with a large, engaged audience. Now let me talk about what this means for media more broadly, because the implications are huge. The traditional media model is built on gatekeepers. Network executives decide what shows get made, editors decide what stories get published, platform algorithms decide what content gets promoted. This creates a system where you need institutional approval to reach a large audience. Rogan broke that system completely. He didn't need network approval, he just started recording conversations. He didn't need editorial approval, he just uploaded raw content. He didn't need algorithm approval, he built a direct audience through word of mouth and quality content. And once he had that direct audience relationship, he had more power than the institutions. He could negotiate with Spotify from a position of strength because they needed him more than he needed them. He could ignore media criticism because his audience trusted him more than they trusted the critics. He could say controversial things without getting fired because he was the owner, not an employee. This is the creator economy model at its absolute peak, one person with authentic connection to millions of people, bypassing all traditional intermediaries. And it's not just Rogan, you're seeing this pattern repeat everywhere. YouTubers with bigger audiences than television networks, newsletter writers with more subscribers than newspapers, TikTok creators with more influence than magazine editors. The entire gatekeeping structure of media is collapsing. But here's what I think is the most interesting strategic lesson from Rogan's success, and this applies way beyond media. Rogan won by optimizing for depth over breadth, at least initially. He didn't try to appeal to everyone, he made 3-hour podcasts for people who wanted depth. He didn't try to please advertisers, he only promoted products he actually used. He didn't try to avoid controversy, he had conversations that interested him even if they upset people. This narrow focus allowed him to build an incredibly loyal core audience. And once you have a loyal core audience, you can expand from there. But if you try to appeal to everyone from the beginning, you end up bland and forgettable. Think about how this applies to business more broadly. Most companies try to be everything to everyone, they want to maximize their addressable market. But the companies that actually win often start by being something specific for someone specific. They go deep with a niche, build loyalty, then expand. Amazon started by just selling books to online shoppers. Facebook started by just connecting college students. Netflix started by just mailing DVDs to movie renters. They all started narrow and went deep before going broad. Rogan did the same thing with media. He started with long-form conversations for people who wanted depth, built a loyal audience, then expanded that audience as more people discovered the value of the format. Another lesson is the power of format innovation. Rogan didn't have better guests than traditional media, especially early on. He didn't have better production values. He didn't have better distribution. What he had was a better format, 3-hour unedited conversations where guests could actually relax and be themselves. That format innovation was enough to beat everyone else in the market because format determines what kind of content is possible. If your format is 7-minute segments with commercial breaks, you can't have deep conversations. If your format is 3 hours with no editing, suddenly you can get to places traditional media can't reach. This is true in every industry. Sometimes the breakthrough isn't better execution of the existing model, it's a new model entirely. Uber didn't beat taxis by having better drivers, they beat them with a better format for how you request and pay for rides. Airbnb didn't beat hotels by having nicer rooms, they beat them with a better format for how you find and book accommodations. Rogan beat traditional media not by being a better journalist, but by creating a better format for long-form conversation. Now let's talk about what's happening right now, because the story's not over. It's 2024-2025 and Rogan is arguably at the peak of his influence. The podcast is still the #1 show in the world. He can get any guest he wants. Politicians fly to Austin to talk to him. Celebrities beg to be on the show. Scientists and authors know that one appearance can make their career. And he's using that platform in interesting ways. During the 2024 election, he had both major presidential candidates trying to get on the show, because they knew one interview with Rogan could reach more young voters than months of traditional campaign advertising. Think about that, the most powerful politicians in the world are courting a podcaster, because he has more influence with certain demographics than the entire mainstream media combined. But there are also challenges. The criticism hasn't stopped, if anything it's intensified. Every controversial guest, every questionable claim, every time Rogan says something that upsets people, there are calls for Spotify to drop him. So far, Spotify has stood by him, but that relationship is always going to have tension. There's also the question of whether the format can last. 3-hour conversations are great when Rogan's genuinely curious about the guest, but can you maintain that curiosity and energy for 1,500 episodes? 2,000 episodes? At some point, does it become a job instead of a passion? And there's competition now. Rogan proved the model works, so everyone's trying to copy it. There are hundreds of long-form interview podcasts now, some with big budgets and major celebrity hosts. The format Rogan innovated has become the standard, which means his advantage is narrowing. But here's what I think gives Rogan staying power: he's authentic in a way that's really hard to fake. You can copy the format, but you can't copy the authenticity. When Rogan's interested in something, you can hear it. When he's skeptical, you can hear it. When he doesn't know something, he admits it. That genuineness is the actual moat, not the format. Let me also talk about the financial impact beyond just Rogan's personal wealth, because this created an entire ecosystem. The success of the Joe Rogan Experience basically created the modern podcast industry as we know it. Before Rogan proved you could make real money from podcasting, it was mostly a hobby or a marketing channel for other businesses. After Rogan, suddenly there's an entire industry. Spotify invested billions into podcasting, acquiring companies like Gimlet Media and Anchor. Apple upgraded their podcast app and started investing in exclusive shows. YouTube started pushing podcasts more aggressively. Advertisers started taking podcast advertising seriously, growing it from a few $100 million market to a multi-billion-dollar market. According to industry reports from the Interactive Advertising Bureau, podcast advertising revenue has grown from about $300 million in 2015 to over $2 billion in 2024. That's not all because of Rogan, but he was definitely the catalyst that made the industry take podcasting seriously as a business. And individual creators made money too. Producers who worked with Rogan went on to start their own shows or production companies. Guests who appeared on his show got book deals and speaking gigs. The entire ecosystem around long-form conversation podcasts exists in large part because Rogan proved it could work. Now let me connect this to some broader patterns I've seen across different industries. One pattern is that major disruption often comes from people who aren't trained in the industry they're disrupting. Rogan wasn't a broadcaster or a journalist, he was a comedian and UFC commentator who just started recording conversations. That outside perspective let him ignore industry wisdom that would have constrained someone with traditional training. This is the same pattern you see with Elon Musk in automotive and aerospace. He wasn't trained as a car guy or a rocket scientist, so he questioned assumptions that industry veterans took for granted. Or Steve Jobs in phones, he came from computers and music players, so he reimagined what a phone could be rather than incrementally improving existing phones. Sometimes the best person to revolutionize an industry is someone who doesn't know the rules well enough to follow them. Another pattern is the power of direct audience relationships in the internet age. Rogan built a direct connection with millions of people through free content, then monetized that connection through sponsorships and eventually licensing deals. This is the same model that YouTubers, newsletter writers, and social media influencers use. Compare that to traditional media where the network owns the audience relationship, not the talent. If you're a television news anchor, CNN or Fox owns your audience. If you leave, you can't take them with you. But if you're a podcaster or YouTuber, you own the relationship. You can move platforms and your audience follows. This shift from institution-owned to creator-owned audiences is one of the biggest changes in media, and Rogan was one of the first to really capitalize on it at scale. There's also the pattern of long-term thinking beating short-term optimization. Rogan spent years building the podcast when it wasn't making much money, when the smart business move would have been to focus on his comedy and UFC careers. But by investing in the podcast for years before it paid off, he built something way more valuable than any short-term opportunity. This is the same pattern you see with Bezos building Amazon for years before it was profitable, or Zuckerberg turning down billion-dollar acquisition offers for Facebook when it was tiny. Sometimes the biggest wins come from sticking with something that looks irrational in the short term but has huge long-term potential. Let me share some numbers about Rogan's broader business empire, because the podcast is just one piece. His comedy tour, which he can promote directly to his podcast audience, sell out arenas and reportedly gross over $20 million per year. He's got a supplement company on it, which was acquired for probably over $100 million, and Rogan had equity in that. He's got revenue from his UFC commentary work. He's got various investments and business ventures that aren't public. When you add it all up, Rogan's probably worth somewhere between $200 and $500 million, depending on how you value his various assets and deals. That's not quite billionaire status, but it's close, and it's all built on the foundation of the podcast. The podcast gave him the audience gave him leverage, the leverage gave him financial opportunities. It's a flywheel that keeps accelerating. Now let me talk about some of the criticism that I think is actually valid, because I don't want to make this seem like Rogan's perfect or the model is without flaws. The lack of editorial filter really does lead to misinformation spreading sometimes. When you have guests on who make false claims and you don't push back or fact-check in real time, some listeners will believe those claims. That's a real problem, especially on topics like health or science where false information can be harmful. Rogan's response is that he's not a journalist and people need to think critically, but I don't know if that's entirely sufficient. When you have that much influence, there's some responsibility to not amplify dangerous falsehoods, even if you're not claiming to be an authority. There's also valid criticism about who gets platformed. Having a conversation with someone doesn't mean endorsing their views, but it does give them access to millions of people and can normalize ideas that maybe shouldn't be normalized. Where exactly that line is, I honestly don't know, but it's a real tension. And there's the question of whether the just asking questions approach is always intellectually honest. Sometimes Rogan platforms ideas that are pretty clearly false or harmful under the guise of open-minded inquiry, and that can be a way of avoiding accountability for spreading those ideas. I'm not saying I have answers to these criticisms, I'm just acknowledging they exist and they're not entirely unfair. But here's what I keep coming back to: the market has spoken. Millions of people choose to listen to Rogan's show. They find value in it. They trust him more than traditional media sources. And you can criticize the format or the content, but you can't deny that it's serving a real audience demand that wasn't being met. Maybe that demand is for misinformation and conspiracy theories, that's the cynical view. Or maybe it's for long-form conversation and diverse perspectives in an era where traditional media has become too filtered and partisan. Probably it's some of both, and different listeners get different things from the show. Let me bring this back to the strategic lessons for anyone building something, because that's really what this show is about. Lesson 1 is that authenticity scales in the internet age. You don't have to be polished or professional to reach millions of people, you just have to be genuine. Rogan's not the smartest interviewer, he's not the most prepared, he's not the most eloquent. but he's himself and people value that. Lesson 2 is that owning the audience relationship is everything. Rogan built a direct connection with listeners that made him powerful enough to negotiate massive deals and survive controversy. If you're building a business, think about how you can create direct relationships with customers rather than depending on platforms or intermediaries. Lesson 3 is that format innovation can beat better execution. You don't have to be the best at the existing game, you can change the game entirely. Rogan didn't try to be a better TV interviewer, he created a new format that made TV interviews obsolete for certain types of conversation. Lesson 4 is that depth can beat breadth, at least initially. Going narrow and deep with a niche audience can be more valuable than trying to appeal broadly to everyone. Once you own a niche, you can expand. Lesson 5 is that patience pays off. Rogan did the podcast for years before it became financially successful. He invested the time and effort because he found it interesting, not because it was immediately profitable. That long-term thinking created something much more valuable than any short-term optimization would have. And lesson 6, which might be the most important, is that you can break the rules if you're solving a real problem. Every piece of conventional wisdom in podcasting said Rogan's approach wouldn't work. Too long, too unfiltered, too inconsistent. But he was solving a real problem, the lack of authentic long-form conversation in media, and solving that problem mattered more than following the rules. These lessons apply way beyond podcasting or media. They're fundamental principles about building valuable things in the digital age. Now I want to end by talking about what I think happens next because the story is still being written. Rogan's deal with Spotify runs through 2027 or so based on the renewal that was reported. After that, he's got options. He could resign with Spotify for even more money. He could leave and start his own platform. He's got the audience to make that work. He could sell to a media company, though that seems unlikely given his desire for creative control. He could retire, though that also seems unlikely given how much he seems to enjoy doing the show. My guess, and this is pure speculation on my part, is that he stays with Spotify or a similar platform but negotiates even more control and even more money. The leverage is entirely on his side at this point. He's proven the value he brings, and there are multiple companies who would pay massive amounts to have him exclusively. But the more interesting question is what happens to media more broadly. Does the Rogan model become the dominant model, where individuals with direct audience relationships have more power than institutions? Or do we see some kind of hybrid emerge where institutions figure out how to work with creators rather than trying to control them? I think we're in the middle of a fundamental restructuring of how media works. The old model of institutional gatekeepers is dying, but the new model isn't fully formed yet. Rogan is one example of what's possible, but there will be other models and other approaches. What's clear is that trust is shifting from institutions to individuals, from credentials to authenticity, from filtered to raw. And that shift, which Rogan both exemplified and accelerated, is going to reshape not just media but politics, education, business, everything that involves communication and persuasion. So that's the story of how Joe Rogan built a podcast empire that made him more influential than cable news networks. He started with literally 0 listeners, just 2 guys and some microphones in a house. He ignored every piece of conventional wisdom about format and length and editing. He built a direct relationship with millions of people based on authenticity and long-form conversation. He turned that relationship into a $200 million plus deal with Spotify and became one of the most powerful media voices in America. And the strategy was simple: be genuine, have real conversations, give people depth instead of sound bites, own your audience relationship, and be patient while it builds. Now look, I've been talking for a while here, and I'm sure I got some details wrong. I wasn't in the rooms when these decisions got made. I'm piecing this together from interviews and reports and analysis. But the core pattern is clear. Rogan created something that traditional media couldn't compete with by doing everything they said wouldn't work. And whether you love him or hate him, whether you think he's good for public discourse or terrible for it, you can't deny the business success. One guy with a microphone built something more valuable and more influential than companies with billions in infrastructure and thousands of employees. That's the power of format innovation, authentic connection, and long-term thinking in the digital age. Alright, so that's the deep dive on Joe Rogan and how he built the most valuable podcast in history. From 0 listeners in 2009 to $200 million deals and more influence than cable news networks. Now look, I'm sure some details here are debatable. I'm synthesizing a ton of information and some of it conflicting. but the strategic patterns are what matter. If this kind of analysis is valuable to you, if you want to understand how companies and creators actually build empires, not the PR version but the real version with all the strategic decisions and pivotal moments, hit that subscribe button. I release new episodes every single day, deep dives into how the world's most successful businesses were actually built. I'm Alex Morgan. Thanks for listening to Behind the Billion.